Nelson Mandela. The man who changed a nation. Before he became president. Before the world called him a hero. Before his name echoed across continents. Nelson Mandela was simply a man who refused to accept injustice as destiny. This is not just the story of a leader. It is the story of a nation broken by hatred, divided by law, and healed by forgiveness. For decades, South Africa lived under the shadow of apartheid. A system built on fear, maintained by violence, and justified by silence. Millions were stripped of dignity. Millions were told they did not belong in their own land. And in the middle of this darkness, one voice rose. Not loud, not violent, but unshakably firm. Nelson Mandela did not seek greatness. He did not chase power. Yet power chased him. Into prison cells. Into courtrooms. And eventually, into history. For 27 long years, he lived behind bars. Cut off from family. From freedom. From the world. But prison could not cage his spirit. Chains could not silence his belief. And time could not erase his hope. When the world expected revenge, he chose reconciliation. When hatred demanded blood, he answered with peace. This documentary is a journey through struggle, sacrifice, and strength. A journey of a man who taught the world that true power is not found in fists, but in forgiveness. This is the story of Nelson Mandela. Born into tradition, early life in Mvezo. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a small village called Mvezo, along the banks of the Mbash River. His birth name was Ralilala, a word in his native Xhosa language that loosely means pulling the branch of a tree, or more simply, troublemaker. He was born into the Thembu royal family, not into wealth, but into tradition, discipline, and leadership. His father was a respected chief and advisor to the local king. From him, young Mandela learned the value of dignity, the power of words, and the importance of standing firm, even when authority is unjust. But when Nelson was still a child, his father died. And with that loss, his life changed forever. He was sent to live under the guardianship of the Thembu king. There, he observed leadership up close. Not through command, but through listening. In tribal meetings, everyone spoke freely. The leader spoke last. This idea stayed with Mandela for life. As a boy, he herded cattle, ran barefoot through fields, and listened to elders tell stories of African heroes who resisted foreign rule. These stories planted a seed, a quiet awareness that his people had once been free, and that freedom had been taken. At school, a teacher gave him an English name, Nelson. A small act, but one that symbolized how African identity was slowly being reshaped by colonial power. Even as a child, Mandela sensed that his life would not be ordinary. The village gave him roots. Tradition gave him strength. And loss gave him purpose. Without knowing it, the journey had already begun. Education, identity, and awakening. As Nelson Mandela grew older, education became his path. Out of the village, and into a wider world. He was sent to missionary schools, where discipline was strict, and tradition met foreign rule. For the first time, he encountered Western education, English language, European history, and laws that did not reflect the lives of African people. He excelled in his studies, not because the system favored him, but because he understood that knowledge was power. Mandela was later admitted to the University of Fort Hare, one of the few institutions where black South Africans could receive higher education. Fort Hare was more than a campus. It was a meeting place of ideas, a place where young minds questioned authority, inequality, and silence. There, Mandela witnessed how unfair rules controlled student life, rules that mirrored the wider injustice of South Africa. When students organized a protest against university policies, Mandela stood with them. It was his first act of defiance. The consequence was swift. He was expelled. This moment forced him to choose obedience or resistance. He left Fort Hare, but he did not leave his beliefs behind. In Johannesburg, Mandela came face to face with the harsh reality of apartheid. He saw past laws, police brutality, and a society built to suppress the majority. The injustice was no longer distant. It was personal. He worked by day, studied law by night, and slowly transformed from a student into a thinker, and then into an activist. Education had opened his eyes. Experience hardened his resolve. Nelson Mandela was no longer just learning about the world. He was preparing to change it. From law student to freedom fighter. In Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela entered a city divided by color and ruled by fear. He began working as a law clerk while continuing his studies through correspondence. By night, he read law books. By day, he witnessed injustice in courtrooms, on streets, and in police stations. Black South Africans were arrested, not for crimes, but for existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Mandela realized something deeply troubling. The law, which was meant to protect, was being used as a weapon. In time, he met others who shared his anger and his hope. Among them was Oliver Tambo. Together, they dreamed of a South Africa where justice was not defined by skin color. In 1952, Mandela and Tambo opened the first black law firm in the country. Their office became a place where ordinary people could finally be heard. But helping the oppressed came at a cost. Mandela joined the African National Congress and threw himself into political activism. He organized protests, led campaigns of civil disobedience, and encouraged people to stand without fear. The government responded with surveillance, harassment, and arrests. Mandela was banned, restricted in movement, and forbidden from speaking publicly. Yet, with every attempt to silence him, his resolve grew stronger. He was no longer just studying the law. He was challenging it. And in doing so, Nelson Mandela crossed a line from reformer to be revolutionary, joining the African National Congress. By the early 1940s, Nelson Mandela understood that individual success meant nothing. Without collective freedom. The African National Congress, the ANC, had existed for decades. But it was cautious, careful, and restrained. Mandela believed the time for patience was over. In 1944, he officially joined the ANC and became part of a new generation that demanded action. Alongside Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, Mandela helped form the ANC Youth League. They rejected the submission. They rejected fear. They called for mass resistance. The Youth League believed freedom would not be handed down. It had to be claimed. Mandela's speeches grew bolder. His confidence sharpened. His leadership became undeniable. He helped organize strikes, boycotts, and campaigns that challenged apartheid laws directly. In 1952, the Defiance Campaign swept across South Africa. Thousands broke unjust laws together, filling jails, overwhelming the system, and exposing its cruelty. Mandela emerged as one of the movement's most powerful voices. The government responded with bans, arrests, and trials. Mandela was charged, convicted, and restricted, but not broken. The more the state pushed back, the more the movement grew. Mandela had fully stepped into national leadership. His path was now clear. There would be no turning back. Peaceful resistance and rising tensions. At first, the struggle was peaceful. Marches, boycotts, strikes. Ordinary people standing together against unjust laws. Nelson Mandela believed that moral pressure could force change. The ANC encouraged discipline, non-violence, and unity. But the government answered peaceful protest with force. Demonstrators were beaten. Leaders were arrested. Meetings were banned. The laws grew harsher. The prisons grew fuller. In 1956, Mandela and many others were charged with treason. For years, they stood trial. Not for violence, but for demanding equality. The treason trial drained them. Financially, emotionally, and physically. Yet it also united the movement. During these years, Mandela lived under constant surveillance. He was followed. His phone was tapped. His freedom narrowed. Then came a moment that changed everything. In 1960, at Sharpeville, police opened fire on unarmed protesters. 69 people were killed. Hundreds were wounded. Peaceful resistance was answered with bullets. The government declared a state of emergency and banned the ANC. Mandela reached a painful conclusion. If peaceful protest was met with massacre, then the struggle had entered a new phase. The question was no longer whether change was needed, but how far they were willing to go to achieve it. The turn to armed struggle, the Sharpeville massacre, left no room for illusion. Peaceful protest had been met with death. For Nelson Mandela, this was not a moment of anger, but of painful clarity. He believed that a movement that refuses to defend itself would be destroyed. After long debate and deep moral struggle, The ANC made a historic decision. In 1961, a new organization was formed. Umkhonto we Sizwe. Meaning, the spear of the nation. Mandela became one of its founding leaders. The goal was not terror. It was pressure. Acts of sabotage were chosen. Over attacks on people, power stations, government buildings, symbols of apartheid authority. Mandela insisted that every effort be made to avoid loss of life. Still, this decision changed everything. The government labeled him a terrorist. He went underground, moving in secrecy, disguised, always watched. The press called him the Black Pimpernel. In 1962, after months in hiding, Mandela was captured. He was charged, convicted, and sentenced. But this was only the beginning. The state wanted to destroy the movement. Instead, it prepared to create a global symbol of resistance. Betrayal, capture, and the Rivonia trial. Nelson Mandela's arrest was not the end of the struggle. It was the moment the world began to watch. After his capture in 1962, Mandela was already serving a prison sentence when police made a discovery that changed everything. At Rivonia, a quiet suburb near Johannesburg, documents were found. They revealed plans, names, and the inner workings of the resistance. The state called it proof of conspiracy. The movement called it betrayal. Mandela and his comrades were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The penalty was death. The Rivonia trial began in 1963. Inside the courtroom, the accused did not beg. They did not deny their beliefs. Mandela stood not as a criminal, but as a representative of millions. Without a voice, he spoke calmly, clearly, without fear. He admitted to sabotage. He explained why. And then, he delivered words that would echo through history. He said he had fought against white domination, and he had fought against black domination. He spoke of a society where all people lived together in equality. It was an ideal, he said, for which he was prepared to die. The courtroom fell silent. The world listened. The judges faced a choice: execute a man or imprison a movement. In 1964, the verdict was delivered: life imprisonment. Nelson Mandela was sent to Robben Island. The cell door closed. But the legend began. I am prepared to die, a historic speech. In the courtroom at Rivonia, the world held its breath. Nelson Mandela rose to speak, not as a defendant, but as the voice of millions, silenced by injustice. He spoke of freedom, not just for himself, but for every South African. Denied dignity, denied equality, denied a place in their own land. He said he had devoted his life to the struggle of his people, to the fight against white domination, and to the vision of a democratic South Africa. He did not plead for mercy. He did not ask for leniency. He said he was prepared to die. These words shocked the courtroom, stirred the nation, and ignited the world. They were a declaration That justice could not be silenced. They were a promise. That hope could not be chained. Even facing the death penalty, Mandela's courage never wavered. Every sentence, every word, was measured, deliberate, and full of moral power. He spoke not as one man, but as the conscience of a nation. Long oppressed, long ignored, long waiting for change. In that moment, Nelson Mandela became more than a man. He became a symbol, a beacon for freedom, a testament to courage, and a warning that injustice could never endure forever. The sentence was life imprisonment. But the world knew. The spirit of Nelson Mandela could not be locked behind walls. Life behind bars, Robben Island years. Robben Island was more than a prison. It was a world apart. Harsh, isolated, and unforgiving. Nelson Mandela arrived. Behind its cold, grey walls. In 1964. A young man of 45. The cells were tiny. The work was grueling. Limestone quarries scarred their bodies. The sun burned mercilessly. The guards were cruel. But the walls could not cage a mind. Mandela studied. He taught. He listened. He became a leader. Not by title, but by example. Every day, he endured humiliation. Every night, he dreamed of freedom. Prisoners were treated as less than human. But Mandela reminded them of their dignity, of their worth, of their purpose. Letters from the outside were rare. News was limited. Yet, the struggle continued in whispers, in quiet lessons, and in the solidarity of the men around him. He turned the island into a school. He taught politics. He taught strategy. He taught hope. Years passed slowly. Decades of hardship. Yet Mandela's resolve never wavered. The outside world began to notice. International pressure mounted. The story of a man who refused to surrender became a symbol of resistance against apartheid. On Robben Island, time became a teacher. Patience became a weapon. And Mandela became a legend. Even behind bars, he did not only survive. He prepared for the day he would lead his nation. Prison as a battlefield of the mind. Robben Island was a prison of stone, but also a battlefield of the mind. Nelson Mandela understood that chains could bind the body, but they could never break the spirit. Days were filled with labor. Quarrying stone, carrying limestone. Working under the scorching sun. Pain became routine. Hunger became normal. Humiliation was constant. Yet, Mandela never allowed despair to take hold. He studied law. He debated politics with fellow prisoners. He taught reading and writing to those who had never learned. He nurtured hope as carefully as he endured pain. Every day, he faced a choice: surrender to bitterness, or transform suffering into strength. He chose the latter. Prison became his classroom. The guards his unwilling teachers. Every insult, every act of cruelty, sharpened his understanding of oppression, justice, and humanity. He learned patience. The kind that strengthens, not weakens. He learned strategy. Not only for freedom, but for a future South Africa built on equality. And he learned the most important lesson: that leadership is not earned by force or fear, but by integrity, courage, and vision. Even in isolation, Mandela's mind roamed free. While the world outside debated his fate, he prepared for the day he would return. and lead his people to freedom. Robben Island was more than a prison. It was a crucible. And Nelson Mandela emerged. Stronger, wiser, and unbroken. Global pressure and the anti-apartheid movement. While Nelson Mandela endured decades behind bars, the world began to take notice. Images of imprisoned leaders, mass protests, and the brutality of apartheid reached every corner of the globe. Governments, activists, and ordinary citizens condemned South Africa's laws. Sanctions were imposed. Divestments followed. Artists, athletes, and students joined boycotts. The message was clear. The world would not remain silent. Inside prison, Mandela felt the weight of both oppression and hope. Letters, though rare, carried encouragement. News of global protests reminded him that he was not alone. The anti-apartheid movement outside South Africa grew stronger each year. Nations debated policy. Companies divested. International unions refused to work with the apartheid state. Every protest, every boycott, every act of solidarity narrowed the gap between Mandela and freedom. The apartheid government, once confident in its power, found itself increasingly isolated. Pressure mounted, and cracks began to appear in the seemingly unshakable system. Mandela's imprisonment had become a global symbol, not of defeat, but of resilience. The world was watching. And slowly, the impossible began to seem possible. The question was no longer if apartheid would end, but when. And the man who had endured decades in a cell would soon play the key role in shaping that future. Secret talks and a nation on the edge. By the 1980s, South Africa was a nation on the brink. Protests, strikes, and uprisings shook the streets. International pressure intensified. The apartheid government found itself trapped between resistance and isolation. Behind the scenes, quiet conversations began. Secret talks between Mandela's representatives and government officials opened the first cracks. In decades of oppression, Mandela himself remained in prison. But his influence reached far beyond the walls. Messages, letters, and intermediaries carried his vision. A peaceful, democratic South Africa, where all races could coexist. The talks were delicate. Every word, every gesture weighed against years of distrust. The government feared loss of control. Mandela feared betrayal of the struggle. Still, he remained patient. He knew that freedom could not be rushed. It could not be bought. It could only be earned. Through courage, strategy, and unwavering principle. The nation teetered on the edge between violence and reconciliation. Mandela's calm, measured leadership from behind bars kept the dream of peace alive. He understood that negotiation was not surrender. It was preparation. And in that quiet struggle, the foundation was laid for the most remarkable chapter in South Africa's history. Freedom after 27 years. On February 11, 1990, the world watched as Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison. 27 years behind bars. Decades of struggle. Countless moments of hardship and sacrifice. The gates opened, and Mandela stepped into sunlight. But his journey was far from over. Crowds cheered. Flags waved. And cameras captured A man who had become a symbol of hope, freedom, and resilience. He embraced the moment with humility. He did not celebrate vengeance. He did not speak of hatred. Instead, he spoke of unity, reconciliation, and the long road ahead. Mandela understood that freedom was not just personal. It was collective. It was the chance to heal a nation torn apart by decades of injustice. His release ignited the world. Activists and leaders found new energy. Oppressors faced mounting pressure. But Mandela's greatest act was the one he would perform quietly, with wisdom and restraint. He chose forgiveness. After 27 years, the prisoner became a leader. The symbol became a man. And hope became reality. The struggle had not ended. But the door to a new South Africa was finally open. From prisoner to negotiator, Nelson Mandela's freedom was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a new chapter. He stepped out of prison, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a leader committed to dialogue, to reconciliation, and to building a nation. Mandela met with the government, with opposition leaders, and with communities divided by decades of fear. Every conversation was careful. Every decision measured. He knew that words could be as powerful as protests, as decisive as any battle. The negotiations were tense. The country teetered on the brink of civil war. Violence simmered in the townships, while extremists on both sides tested the limits of patience. Through it all, Mandela remained calm. He listened. He reasoned. He refused to be provoked. His goal was clear. A democratic South Africa, where all citizens, regardless of race, could live with dignity and equality. Mandela understood that true leadership is not about domination, but about bringing people together. He became the bridge between fear and hope, between anger and reconciliation, between a painful past and a promising future. The prisoner who had endured 27 years was now the negotiator who would guide a nation toward freedom and unity. Dismantling Apartheid. Nelson Mandela's negotiations bore fruit. But the work was far from over. Apartheid, a system built over decades, was deeply entrenched. Segregation, discrimination, and oppression had touched every corner of South African life. Mandela faced immense challenges. Hardliners resisted change. Fear lingered in the hearts of the powerful. Communities still bristled with anger. Yet Mandela remained steadfast. He believed that South Africa's future depended on inclusion, not vengeance. He worked tirelessly to dismantle laws that divided people. He championed a new constitution, guaranteeing equality, freedom, and human rights for all citizens. Every negotiation required courage. Every compromise demanded patience. Mandela's leadership was a balancing act, holding the nation together while dismantling centuries of injustice. With each step forward, apartheid's grip weakened. International sanctions eased. Opposition leaders joined the talks. Hope, once fragile, began to grow stronger. Through it all, Mandela never wavered. He reminded South Africans that the future would not be built on anger, but on justice, understanding, and reconciliation. Slowly, methodically, the chains of apartheid were broken. The impossible was becoming possible. South Africa was preparing for a new dawn. Nobel Peace Prize, a shared victory. In 1993, Nelson Mandela stood on the world stage. Not just as a leader of South Africa, but as a symbol of courage, resilience, and reconciliation. That year, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, alongside President F. W. de Klerk, for their efforts to end apartheid peacefully and build a democratic nation. It was a victory not just for Mandela, but for all who had struggled against oppression. The award recognized more than political skill. It celebrated a man who chose forgiveness over vengeance, dialogue over violence, and unity over division. Mandela's smile that day was more than personal triumph. It was a message to the world. Even in the darkest circumstances, hope can prevail. He credited the people of South Africa, the countless activists, and the global community that had pressured the apartheid government to change. For Mandela, this recognition was never about glory. It was about a shared victory, a triumph of humanity over hatred, of reconciliation over revenge, and of courage over fear. The Nobel Peace Prize cemented his legacy as a leader whose vision extended far beyond borders, inspiring generations around the world to fight for justice with dignity and compassion, becoming South Africa's first black president. In 1994, history was made. Nelson Mandela was elected as the first black president of a free South Africa. The victory was more than political. It was the triumph of a dream that had been nearly impossible. For generations, millions of South Africans lined up to vote, some for the first time in their lives. Their voices, once silenced, now echoed through the nation. Mandela stood not just as a leader, but as a unifying symbol. He knew the weight of the moment was heavier than any crown. He inherited a country scarred by decades of oppression, divided by fear, and haunted by past violence. Yet he did not seek revenge. He did not aim to punish. He aimed to heal. Mandela worked tirelessly to unite a nation through dialogue, fairness, and compassion. He reached out to former enemies, inviting them to share power and build a future together. Every speech, every decision was guided by a single vision: a South Africa where all citizens, regardless of race, could live with dignity and equality. Mandela's presidency was not just a personal achievement. It was a promise fulfilled. A promise that freedom, justice, and humanity could triumph over hatred. He became the living proof that even the deepest divisions could be bridged with courage, wisdom, and forgiveness. Leadership through reconciliation. Nelson Mandela understood that leading a nation was more than passing laws or holding office. It was about healing wounds that ran deep, decades long, and often deadly. He reached out to former oppressors and invited them into the process of nation building. He encouraged dialogue instead of revenge, compassion instead of bitterness. Mandela's leadership was defined by forgiveness, a power far greater than fear. He promoted the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a bold experiment where victims and perpetrators could confront the past and seek understanding. Through his calm presence, Mandela inspired South Africans to trust each other again, to see beyond color, beyond history, to a shared future. Even in the face of pressure, threats, and lingering hatred. Mandela remained steady. He reminded the nation that lasting peace could only come from empathy, courage, and justice. Under his leadership, South Africa began to heal. The nation learned that strength lies not in dominance, but in reconciliation. Mandela taught the world that true leadership is measured not by power, but by the ability to unite even those who once opposed you. Truth, forgiveness, and national healing. Nelson Mandela believed that a nation could only move forward by confronting its past with honesty and courage. He championed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a place where victims could tell their stories and perpetrators could confess their crimes. The process was not easy. It forced South Africans to face pain, betrayal, and loss. But Mandela knew that forgiveness was not weakness. It was strength. It was the only path to lasting peace. He encouraged his people to let go of hatred, to replace anger with understanding, and to build a society where every citizen could live with dignity. Mandela himself set the example. He forgave those who had imprisoned him, who had oppressed his people, who had tried to destroy him. Through his actions, he taught the world that reconciliation is a choice, a daily effort, and a foundation for freedom. South Africa began to heal. Old wounds slowly closed. Communities once divided began to see each other as neighbors, not enemies. Mandela showed that even after decades of injustice, a nation could rise if its people embraced truth, courage, and forgiveness. The story of South Africa's rebirth is inseparable from the story of Mandela and the extraordinary power of a reconciled heart. The cost of freedom, personal sacrifices. Nelson Mandela's fight for freedom came at a tremendous personal cost. He spent 27 years in prison. Years without his family. Years without the freedom to live an ordinary life. He missed birthdays, weddings, and the growth of his children. He endured isolation, illness, and hardship. Yet, he never wavered. He placed the needs of his nation above his own desires. Mandela understood that true freedom demands sacrifice, and he accepted it willingly. Not for glory, but for justice and humanity. Mandela beyond politics. Nelson Mandela was more than a politician. He was a teacher, a mentor, and a moral compass. Even after leaving the presidency, he continued to fight for peace, for equality, and for human rights around the world. He used his voice to inspire, to heal, and to remind humanity of the power of courage and integrity. Mandela showed that leadership is not only in office, but in action, in example, and in the quiet strength to do what is right. Final years and farewell to a giant. In his later years, Mandela slowed his public life, but his presence remained immense. He traveled, spoke, and supported causes that reflected his lifelong values. On December 5, 2013, the world mourned the passing of a man whose life had touched millions. Leaders and citizens alike honored his legacy, celebrating not just a president, but a symbol of hope, justice, and humanity. The legacy of Nelson Mandela. Mandela's life teaches us that one person can change history. He demonstrated that courage, forgiveness, and perseverance can overcome even the deepest injustice. His legacy is not only in laws passed or offices held, but in hearts inspired, in minds awakened, and in nations transformed. Nelson Mandela showed the world that freedom is never free, and justice is never easy, but both are worth the fight. Epilogue: What the world learned from Madiba. Nelson Mandela leaves a lesson for every generation. True power is not in anger. True strength is not in domination. True change comes from courage, from empathy, and from the unwavering belief that humanity is stronger than hatred. Madiba's life is a reminder that one person, with vision, patience, and love, can alter the course of history. And though he has passed, his spirit endures, guiding all who dare to dream of a better, fairer world.
For more powerful stories from history, subscribe to Legacy by MAO. Your support truly matters.